This is Stigma, where we talk with leaders from many industries about how mental health and addiction have impacted their lives. Many people suffer silently from mental illness, addiction, depression, anxiety, and trauma. They never seek help because of stigma. In this podcast, host Stephen Hayes and his guests share their stories of recovery in order to encourage others to do the same. Here's Stephen.
Welcome back to another episode of the Stigma podcast. Today, I want to dive into what is bipolar disorder, and not from a clinical perspective, but what does it look like? Is it the same for everyone who has it? Does it look like what they showed us on TV in Shameless or in Ozark? How do people manage it? Today, you're going to hear from two guys, one me and one Jason Finucan, my guest. He's a mental health advocate. He's written a book about stigma. He's really honestly been inspirational and motivational in my life. And this conversation is going to paint the picture for you of what bipolar looks like, whether you're struggling with it or do you think you might, or whether you have a loved one that might be. We hope this conversation will be helpful. So without further ado, Jason, thank you for being on the show, man.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Stephen. Thanks for having me.
I'd love to, before we get into it, I'd love to have you tell our audience a little bit about your bio background and your story.
Sure. I founded a company called StigmaZero, which helps employers to improve mental health awareness, improve the way they respond to mental illness. And I got into that work in the strangest way possible. I actually experienced a major physical illness as a young boy. I had open heart surgery due to a nerve defect in my heart. And then in my 20s, I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. And the reason I tell you about both of those illnesses is the former helped me to understand the stigma that came with the latter, because as you might imagine, there is absolutely zero stigma that is placed on someone who has a heart defect. And yet when I was facing the bipolar disorder, there was an enormous amount of stigma. Firstly, from my own perspective, I had a lot of self-stigma towards mental illness. And I went from that experience to realizing we have a problem in our society, the way that we respond to mental illness, the way that we understand it, and that stigma is a huge factor in the experience of anyone facing this challenge. And I just wanted to help. And so for many years, from 2006 to 2014, I acted as a volunteer mental health advocate. I spoke, I told my story, and I just tried to help to educate people about this. And it was through that work and the response to that work, which was very emphatically positive, that I decided to focus on helping employers and founded my company. So
what does your company do for employers? I mean, what is the tool, or what is it? How does an employee at a company interface with your product?
That's a great question. We offer an online training program. And we also offer live keynotes that I deliver. And I also help with some companies hire me as a consultant to help with specific cases. But the vast majority of the interface would be through our online program, which trains employees, managers, as well as senior leaders in HR to learn about this, to understand it, and to go through situational training, figuring out, how should they respond in various situations, and what should they say and what shouldn't they say. And the goal is to change the way the culture works around this topic.
Got it. And you wrote a book about this, right? I mean, you wrote a book called Jason 1, StigmaZero. Can you tell me a little bit about the book and the title? Like, why do you, I guess, couch this topic in terms of like a scoreboard of you versus stigma? How did you come up with that idea?
Yeah, that one came late. Actually, the book was completely written and I was about to publish it, and only then did I figure out the title. It's funny how it works sometimes. But the reason we went with the idea of a score is because, as I said, I'm diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and the way that I view that, and the way anyone should view that is a chronic lifetime illness that I have to manage and I have to be aware of. So it's not Jason 1 bipolar 0, because I didn't overcome bipolar. I can only live well with it. But what I did do was I absolutely overcame stigma. As I mentioned, I was someone who suffered pretty badly from self-stigma, and I basically was part of the problem that I'm trying to help people solve now, which is that I viewed mental illness as a character flaw, something that a person with willpower and a work ethic could overcome. And I tried to do that for 2.5 years and just got worse and worse and worse. And I only began to own my illness and begin to recover, find treatments that worked only after I eliminated stigma. And so the goal of the book is to say, look, I overcame stigma, so can you, whether that's about your own illness or about the illness of someone you know.
So bipolar disorder, man, this is something we have in common because I'm type 1 bipolar, and I think you said you're type 1 as well. Is that right?
That's correct.
So I want to help people understand what that even is and what it looks like. And there's kind of two audiences for that conversation. There's people out there who are struggling with something and they might be bipolar and they don't know if they have it and they're trying to figure it out. There's also another audience of people out there that have a loved one or a friend that's struggling and they don't know if the behavior they're seeing is something like bipolar, or if it's, lack of sleep, or they're hungry, or what it is. So I want to kind of draw out from our both of our experiences what it looks like. And I think a good place to start is at what age did you first realize there was something going on where there might be an issue of some sort?
For me, it actually came relatively late. I think, the majority of people who are diagnosed with bipolar disorder, it tends to come between 18 and like 24. I was 26 before any symptoms of any kind ever surfaced. And the first symptoms that surfaced for me, it was a mild depression that lasted 3 months. And I had zero concept that what I was going through was depression. I didn't even understand that that's what it could be, because I'd never felt anything like that before. And the basic way that I've understood bipolar through my research and through living it is that the difference between bipolar and, for example, clinical depression, which is sometimes called unipolar depression, is that if you experience depression, you simply experience falls down from your baseline into various severity of the symptoms of being depressed. Bipolar, you actually also experience states above the baseline, which includes mania and hypomania, which simply means mild mania or moderate mania. And I began bouncing from depressive into hypomania and back and forth on 2 to 3 month segments. And for the first long while, I really didn't understand what was happening, and it was quite disruptive to my life. And then when I started to suspect that it might be a mental illness, that's when self-stigma kicked in, and I just flat out denied it and said, no, I'll be fine. I'll work through this. I can take care of it.
Yeah, it's something I want to point out here. So the cycle time. A lot of people think that bipolar is just this erratic up and down, but the cycle time is actually a lot longer than I think the average person thinks. And in fact, I didn't know this until I went to rehab, and I read this in a book called Moodswing that was written in, I think it was like written in the 80s by one of the doctors that pioneered the use of lithium treatment for bipolar. And it turns out, I learned from that book that cycling through from depressive state to manic state more than once or twice in a year is considered rapid cycling. So cycling through these mood states isn't something that happens every day, is it? I mean, it happens over a long period of time. How did that manifest itself for you? I mean, when did you realize that these changes in how you felt were part of something broader than just, the weather or, breaking up with a girlfriend or something like that?
Yeah, I have to say that on a certain level, I knew within the first year, because within the first year, I had gone through 2 major states, a long depression and then a very long, mild hypomanic phase. And again, mild hypomania is incredibly difficult to diagnose while you're experiencing it, because, I mean, you and I could be qualified as mildly hypomanic just, because we're on the ball and have energy. But
Right.
the truth is, and the way that I help people understand it now, is that when you are in a state like that, just like depression, it is 24 hours a day until it stops. And that's what's unusual.
How long can it last? How long did it last for you, these states?
The longest it ever lasted for me was 4 straight months.
And which is, I mean, that's incredible.
It's
You
long.
think about something I want to like explain to people, because I had some pretty long manic states too. Your body isn't made to handle that. Your brain, your mind, your emotions aren't made to handle that, and the people in your life are certainly not made to handle that. And
No.
the wreckage that you can cause in your life during a 4-month manic state is inexplainable, honestly, at least from my experience.
Yeah, and I do want to clarify because I wasn't fully manic for 4 straight months, but I would be hypomanic for 4 straight months. So, for example, I use sleep as a good litmus test, and I think most people can relate to this. I'm the kind of person who likes to get about 7 hours a night, 7.5. That's my normal, my baseline. When I was depressed, that would jump up to 9 or 10 hours a day. And then when I was hypomanic, that would suddenly drop to 4.5 to 5.5 hours a night, which I had never kept a schedule like that in my whole life. And suddenly that's all the sleep I could get because I would wake up jumping out of bed. I'd want to go jog, which I'd never done before. I had just excess energy, but it was manageable in the sense that I didn't need to be hospitalized. I wasn't behaving so erratically that it was a major problem, but it was a problem for sure. The longest I've ever been fully manic, I had a 6 day long, full force manic episode that resulted in me being hospitalized for 3 weeks. And I can tell you that had that 6 day episode gone to 9 days or to 14 days, I don't know if I would have known who I was or where I was. I was really deteriorating fast, but I also didn't sleep 1 minute for those 6 days, which in and of itself is a very dangerous way to live.
Yeah. And that's what it looks like. I mean, it's really scary. I've been through it. And another question I had for you along those lines is, so you were 26 when you kind of saw your first symptoms. How soon after that did you go see someone that diagnosed you?
Yes, and I have to. This is a fun story just because it's an example of how powerful self-stigma can be. When I finally realized I needed some form of help, I was still resisting the idea that I had a mental illness, and I was resisting the idea of taking treatment for a mental illness. I don't know why, but I was highly stigmatized towards that idea. So here I was, a very unwell 27, 28-year-old. I could tell that something was wrong. And my first step was to see a psychologist for talk therapy, something I've never done before. And there's nothing wrong with that. But I wasn't doing it because I believed I needed therapy. I was doing it in the hopes that I would find some reason for all of this that was happening to me. I
I
would.
did the same thing, man.
Did
I
you?
went to a therapist a couple times in my life. I did it in high school, and then I did it again in 2014. I walked in really motivated to find out what the hell was wrong with me. And both of those interactions with therapists did not lead to figuring out what the problem was and did not lead to help. And I went back out for years and tried to cope with it myself.
Oh wow. Well, where I got lucky, and I honestly I don't even remember this therapist's name anymore, but I thank her as often as I can. She saw me 6 sessions, and at the end of the 6 sessions, she said something I would never forget, and it's in my book. She said, "Jason, I have 78 patients, and you are the least in need of my services." She said, from an emotional standpoint, from a past trauma standpoint, from an early childhood trauma standpoint, you are the most organized person I've ever met. Yeah, some bad things happened to you, but you figured them out and you worked on them. The reason you are experiencing what you are experiencing has nothing to do with your past. She said, I can't diagnose you because I'm a psychologist. I'm not a psychiatrist, but I believe you have bipolar disorder, and I recommend highly you go see a psychiatrist right away. And that,
And what age was that? What age was that when you got that advice?
28.
So it'd been a couple years. So you've
It
been
had
living
been.
with this, and there was an issue, and it was a few years before you got real help.
Yes. And I have to say that was the first break in the wall of stigma that was in my mind, because suddenly I had a woman who was a medical professional who had done her diligence and who was giving me this advice that was very clinical and very black and white. And it just made me realize that, wait a second, this is an illness, not a character flaw. Like that was one of the first times I thought of it that way. And once I thought of it like an illness, I had my heart surgery and my heart defect to fall back on mentally. I was able to say, well, what would I be doing right now if my heart problem was coming back instead of this new problem of bipolar disorder? Well, I'd be
Right.
behaving totally differently. I wouldn't be afraid of stigma. I wouldn't be afraid of telling my boss or my colleagues. I would be seeking medical attention immediately. So why am I not doing that? And that's when things started to shift in my thinking.
One of the things I wanted to ask you about, because we talked about this when we spoke privately, is that a lot of people who have this, I guess it manifests itself in different ways and they cope with it in different ways. So for me, I coped with the depression and I coped with the mania with substances. I used drugs to get me out of low states. I used alcohol to depress the manic states. And during the times where I used those things, I behaved in a way that made my life even worse. So then I started feeling bad about that. And so then I drank and used more. And I entered this really vicious cycle for years and years where, I just couldn't get out. And so addiction became a really byproduct for me, at least. And I'm not saying it's always that way, and I'm not a doctor. For me, I think addiction was a byproduct of my bipolar disorder. But you didn't experience that, right? Like, how did you cope with it?
Yeah, all I can say about why I didn't fall into that trap, because it is a common trap. I'm not a doctor either, but look, having done the research that I've done, your experience is not uncommon to self-medicate through, a major illness like bipolar disorder or even clinical depression or anxiety. Self-medicating is a major problem, major hurdle a lot of people go through. Now, why I didn't, honestly, it feels like luck. Part of it may be because some of my attitudes towards mental illness were formed because my mother had suffered from very severe depression for most of my life growing up. And she had attempted suicide when I was 8. And there was something about her. She had self-medicated heavily, mostly with alcohol. And I had, on a very deep level, I had associated excessive drinking or excessive drug use and attempted suicide, any attempt at suicide. I just associated those all as to be avoided, like in a very formative way. I was only 8 years old when my mom did this. So she survived her attempt, thankfully, and I had many years with her after that. But I think that affected me on a very deep level, and it prevented me from going in that direction. How did I cope with it? I don't know. I look back and I don't even know how I made it through 3 straight months of severe depression. I can be very resilient in that sort of just wait it out kind of way. And I did have support. When I went through the worst of my illness, I was actually with my ex, who I was engaged to at the time. And she was an incredible caregiver. She tried very, very hard to help and did a lot of good to help me through all of that. So certainly that helped. But I really feel that it is a combination of that early childhood, idea that formed in my head about drugs and alcohol. And I'm not saying I don't drink, but I've always been very cautious about drinking to excess. So it just wasn't one of my tools I grabbed for when I was in that state.
So when you were in a depressive state, or when you were in hypomanic or an elevated state or a manic state even, what did your friends and family observe? What did it look like? For me, they observed I burned down relationships. I got thrown out of country clubs. I got arrested. They saw the drinking and the aggressive behavior. What was it that the people around you in your life saw when you were struggling?
Honestly, I think it's a milder version of your story, because I didn't have the complicating factor of alcohol and drugs. It made for, when I was depressed, I just would disappear from society, from friends, from everybody. When it was really bad, I couldn't work. I would have to take leaves of absence, sick leaves from work. And I would, in a severe depression, I would probably sleep 16 to 18 hours a day. I would eat very little. And when I could, I would get out and go for a walk. And honestly, that was a big day. If I got out and went for a walk, it was once in a week. And then as for the hypomania, I'm a very happy-go-lucky, friendly person. And so when I'm hypomanic, it's a little bit like being mildly drunk, in the sense that your inhibitions are slightly looser. And I just became more gregarious and more friendly and wanted to be more productive at work and take on more projects at home. And people would notice, they would kind of say, wow, Jason seems a little bit amped, a little bit more than normal. And it was definitely obvious. Where I was manic, that was when the behavior really departed from my norm. I'll give one example. My father and I are incredibly close. We're like, he's been like a friend as much as a father my whole life. And during my manic episode, the only person I lashed out at was my dad. And I did it on the phone, 2 different occasions where we were talking on the phone. He said nothing that should have incited an anger response, but I completely lost my temper. I yelled at him. I swore at him. And thankfully, he never viewed that. He said he just looked at the phone and went, well, that's not my son. Whatever's happening to him, that's not him. And he didn't take it personally, and it was incredible. But that's an example of like, where on earth did that anger come from, let alone why was it directed at my father, whom I have no anger towards. So there was, strange things like that. I became pretty belligerent during my manic episode. I needed people to listen to me, but I wasn't articulate. So I was slow to get to the point, but I was talking fast, and people would get impatient.
Oh, yeah.
And I would say, listen, you can sit down and watch a movie for 2 hours. You can listen to me for 5 minutes. That was my line. But it was not healthy. It was not a good thing. And ultimately, the only time I actually haven't been arrested, but the only time I've been in the back of a cop car was at the end of my manic episode. That's how my family finally got me into the hospital, because I was resisting. I kept saying, no, I want to just go to a hotel and rest and sleep it off. But they knew at this point I was manic and it wasn't going to work. And they involved the police. And when I saw the cop, I didn't fight. I just went, oh, wow, are you here for Jason Finucan? He looked at me and said, yeah. And I said, okay, well, I guess I'll get in the back seat. I got in the cop car and was taken to the hospital. And that began my 3-week stay in a psychiatric hospital, which was by no means fun, but it was an important first step in me finally being diagnosed as bipolar 1, finally being treated with the right medication, and really beginning my long crawl back to wellness.
I want to get into treatment and wellness in just a second, but one of the things I want to really draw out for people listening here is that Hollywood, the movies, TV, people talk about this disease and they try to portray it in a way, and they try to, maybe they don't try, but what happens is people think, okay, bipolar, that's these 3 traits. That's this thing that looks like that's X right, or Y. And it doesn't. It's different. It's very different for everyone who experiences it. And there isn't, just like you can't stereotype someone based on race or gender, you can't stereotype someone based on having this disorder.
Such a good point.
You can't think about it that way. It's different. Like Jason and I have such different experiences, but we have the same disease.
That's right. And at what age did it manifest in you?
So I'm not 100% certain. I had relational difficulties early, middle school, high school. And I think that was probably some of the first symptoms. I had depressive states, and then I had manic states, but I didn't know it. And then I went to West Point, and there, it's funny, and this is something I really want to explain to people. From the moment I went to West Point, through getting an MBA and going to Wall Street, I was living in an environment where this was actually quite common. And the people that I worked for, the people that my teammates, they would benefit from my mania. My mania was a superpower to me at many times in my life, especially when I needed to stay up for 5 straight days and get work done, or I needed to travel around the world doing transactions for the investment bank I worked for. It became a superpower. In fact, to the point where I didn't want to give it up. So later in my 20s and then early 30s, people said things to me that made me go, man, I think there might be something here. But I just didn't want to give it up. I thought I couldn't be successful without it. I thought I'd never be fun without it. I thought my life would be boring without it. I thought it was actually my best quality for a long time.
That is a very common reality when it comes to particularly bipolar. You don't hear people talking about their depression as a superpower because, of course, depression pulls you back and limits you. If you look through history, there are so many brilliant scientists, artists, across the board, across all industries. There are very smart people who likely experience what was then called manic depressive disorder. And yes, when you're manic, if you're just the right kind of manic, you can have a combination of additional creativity and additional energy, which sounds intoxicating, and it can be intoxicating. And I am asked at every keynote I give, I have a Q&A at the end, and I'm always asked, do you miss mania? Do you miss even hypomania? And, the answer is that there's a part of me that can pretend, I can look back and say, yeah, part of it was fun, but I have the perspective to see that it is destructive more than anything, and that I prefer, frankly, to have balance, because I don't feel muted as a result of being treated. I don't feel like I don't have access to all of my faculties or all of my creativity. I wrote a book. These things are still there. And speaking with you, you certainly are someone who is living a very, very full life. And so it's just realizing the difference between something that might feel good versus something that is sustainable. And I mean healthy. It's sustainable in a healthy way. And that's how I view it. And I've always been able to look back and say that I don't miss it. I really don't at all. And I haven't experienced even the mildest of hypomania since 2005 in June, when the treatment started to work for me. And so I can, I'm speaking very honestly about that it's, I view it as dangerous. And if it came back, if I suddenly felt hypomanic now, I would be very quick to try to treat it.
How do you know that this is a question that I struggle with today. How do you know when something happens and you feel elevated that it's a normal elevated response versus this could be old me? This could be old hypomanic, manic. This could actually be a real problem.
Yes, and that is so important. I mean, managing an illness like the one we have does require some vigilance and just being consistent. The way that I've always looked at that, in the first 2 years after I came off of the manic episode and was treated and my symptoms were gone, I did worry. Every time I felt good, I was like, uh-oh, is this too good? And then I quickly realized there's something extremely simple as a way to tell. And it's just tracking your sleep, tracking your energy over the course of multiple days, establishing a baseline. So, we talked about sleep earlier. I said I'm about a 7.5 hour person. You might be 5 or 9. It doesn't matter what your average sleep is. We all know what our average healthy amount of sleep is if it's not impeded by something in life. Try to get that amount and then watch to see if it changes. And that's how I've always, if I have a great day, I mean, I'm a golfer, for example, and a couple of years ago, I got my first hole in one. That was a pretty good day. Yeah, I was excited about that. So of course I was in a giddy mood all afternoon and all evening, but I went to sleep at the same time and I slept like a baby. That's not hypomania. I was
not even close.
Exactly. So that's generally, sleep is the canary in the coal mine for bipolar. It really helps if you know what your average sleep number is and you watch out for the differences. And back in the day, I used to track it in my computer in Excel. It was very laborious. But now, of course, I use an app, and it takes me 2 minutes every day, and I put in the data points of how I'm feeling, and is there any depression, any anxiety, any elevated energy. And over a period of time, the data speaks.
What app are you using?
I use an app called Moods. I found it. Okay. Honestly, I went onto the App Store. I searched for mood trackers. That was actually the search string I put in. And I found 5 that looked interesting. I tested them all. And then I decided upon Moods because I found it just the most user-friendly. And it's very good.
So besides tracking your mood, and this is kind of the last question I had for you here, but what else do you do to manage the bipolar? I mean, from medication to support to family, friends, what does your wellness routine look like, and how is your bipolar sort of shaped it?
Sure. Let me start by saying it is important to know that not everyone with a mental illness needs medical treatment. And there are many people who are able to manage anxiety or even mild depression without a medical treatment. They can just do it with exercise and food. However, there are people who mistakenly believe all mental illnesses can be treated without some sort of medical treatment. And I say, have you ever looked at a person who has to take insulin every day because of type 1 diabetes and said to them, if you just tried a little harder, you don't need that insulin, do you?
Yeah, right.
We don't do that because we understand that person has a body that isn't functioning 100% properly, and the insulin in their case solves the problem. And in my case, I do need medical treatment. And it started out as lithium only, which I began taking in 2005, and I still take to this day. And it does an amazing job at completely eradicating any hypomania or mania. I have had exactly zero.
I take lithium
Do you?
as well,
Yeah,
twice a day.
and
1,200 milligrams.
yeah, I think I'm on exactly the same amount, 1,200. And the thing about it for me was lithium also treated the depression for a long time. And then it just didn't anymore. And we couldn't figure it out, exactly why. We tried increasing the lithium. It didn't work. I ended up with too many side effects. So then we decreased the lithium again. And we introduced in 2012 a secondary drug called Cipralex, which is an antidepressant that works quite well with bipolar individuals who are also, because some antidepressants can push a bipolar patient up into a manic episode. Cipralex is known for working well with lithium and with a person with bipolar. So I started that medication, and within a month, it became effective, and it completely stopped the depressive symptoms, which were only mild but were persistent. And from 2012 till now, I have had twice to increase the dosage of Cipralex, but that's it. I'm still on that medication, and so that's my medical treatment to it. The other ways that I manage my illness involve, as I mentioned, tracking sleep, tracking energy, tracking mood. I eat really well, and that is 100% because of my wife. She is an amazing. She's very focused on healthy food, and she's the one who buys the food in the house. And honestly, I just eat what she tells me to eat, and it's great.
Same here, man. My wife has done a great job of keeping me on a ketogenic diet. One, because I need to get in a little bit better shape, and two, because I've done a lot of research. And I had a guest on the podcast a couple of weeks ago that has explained there's a lot of benefits to people with mood disorders and other mental illnesses that come from changing your body's energy source from carbs and other stuff to fat.
It is so true. And so for me, I view it as equally health related. Just want to, be fit as I can and be as healthy as I can. And the other is that it is better for the mental illness for sure. Sleep is a massive one. When I say I track my sleep, if I have a bad night's sleep and I get 5 hours, which is very rare, thankfully, but if it happens, I make sure the next night nothing gets in the way of me getting a good night's sleep. I just don't have multiple bad nights in a row, because I don't let it happen. It's too high a priority. And then, everything, the biggest thing, to be honest, because this is where we all manage our energy every day. We all have a lot to do. We all want to do a lot of things. We want to be productive. I know where to draw my line. I know exactly how hard I can work, and I know how hard I can play. And I know when to say, I'm done. I'm backing out. And that could mean I work a little bit less than the average person, but I get a lot done while I'm working. And if I'm out socializing, I'm usually the first guy to leave the party. And that's okay, because I need my rest. I can't do that anymore. And I don't care. It doesn't hurt me. It doesn't bother me. It feels like a smart management of my illness and of my energy. And for me, it's all about energy. Do I have the energy I need to do what I want to do? And if my energy is hurting, then I rest. And it has helped me quite a bit over the years.
Got it. Yeah, that's great. I think that's really educational. I think it helps for people to know, what this looks like, and then how it gets treated and what the treatments do for us. So I really appreciate you sharing that. And that was really my last question. I mean, is there anything I missed about that you wanted to cover?
I just wanted to highlight again this idea that mental illnesses are experienced differently by different people, and also that you brought up pop culture. Those are two things that I believe are so important. I made them into modules or lessons in my online program that we offer through StigmaZero. And I'll give you an example. The pop culture thing is a real problem. A lot of people think if they see bipolar disorder on television or in movies, it is almost always just the mania they're showing. And there's a reason. I understand it. It's not that interesting to watch a person sleep 16 hours a day. But the reality is the representation of the illness seems to only be towards the manic, disjointed, and perhaps dangerous side. And that's a real problem. That leads and adds to the stigma. And the other aspect is how differently people can experience the same illness. I'm going to add a third person. This is a woman that we feature in our online program. It's a link to her TED Talk. Her name is Jane Gethers. She is an African-American woman in the US. She also has Bipolar-1. And if you compare to your experience, my experience, and her experience, they would be entirely different, all three. That is a remarkable perspective to remember, that it is not as simple as saying, oh yeah, I met one person with that illness, that therefore I understand that illness. Mental illnesses are complicated, and you need to respect that and to understand that different people are going to experience things differently.
Well, look, man, I'm really appreciative that you did this. Thank you for being here. I think it's really important. I think we're going to help some people. I think we're going to help some people who are struggling. I think we're also going to help the loved ones of some people who are struggling to understand this a little bit better. I think we're also going to reduce stigma a little bit by educating folks on what this illness is and what it looks like and how we deal with it. So, man, I'm really grateful that you came on today and did this.
I am so happy to be here, and honestly, just to be part of a discussion between two men with mental illness. How many times do we see that right now? It's just, there's not enough of us that are speaking openly about it. And the more of us that do it, the more men out there will realize there's no shame in having a mental illness. It's simply an illness. It's a biological failure of the way your brain works, and it can be treated. And so let's eradicate this stigma and get people the help they need.
Thank you again, Jason, for coming on, man. I really enjoyed our conversation. And I think that this is going to be helpful for people. When you get two people with the same mental illness talking about their different experiences, the different outcomes in their lives, the different ways they've treated it, I think that educates people. That helps people who may need to get help. That helps people who may have a loved one that needs to get help. And so I really feel good about this conversation and sharing it with the public. And a special thank you to our guests. Thank you for listening, and thank you for letting us share with you. Thank you for being here. We'd really love to hear from you. You can reach out to us on our website, stigmapodcast.com. You can find us on Instagram, Stigma Podcast. On Twitter, we're StigmaCast. You can email us, info@stigmapodcast.com. If you liked our content, we'd love for you to give us a like or a subscribe or a review on any podcast platform where you listen. As we grow our following, we're able to bring you more and more mental health content. But more than anything, we really want to hear from you. What did you think? What was your reaction? How do you feel about what you heard today? Until next time, thanks for being here.